painters designing game maps for map games. This is the panel where I've collected the best and brightest from Triumph and PDS to talk about game maps, both the historical variety and the randomly generated one. So let's go straight ahead and meet our panelists for this talk. And we'll start in the top left with Drikos. Who are you and what do you do?
I'm Drikos. You might know me as Bratton on the forums. I'm a content design lead on an undisclosed project at PDS right now, but I've worked on the maps for Hearts of Iron 4 and Imperator Rome a little bit.
And then we have Emil in the middle.
Hello, my name is Emil Tisander. You might know me as Servancor on the forums, and I am the game designer on CK3, where I am also the designated map champion, where I have the sole responsibility of making sure that the map is as good as it possibly can be.
And then in our bottom left, we have Jacob.
Yeah, I'm Jakob Mattis, or Jacob is also fine. Yeah, Age of Wonders fans, or especially Age of Wonders 3 players, may know me from modding as Eomorch. After modding Age of Wonders 3, I joined Triumph for Age of Wonders Planetfall, where I became the, lead campaign designer, but really for the most time I was also the only campaign designer, so that doesn't say too much. Yeah, that's it.
And finally, in our bottom right, we have Henrik.
Yes, and I'm Henrik Lomander. I've worked on maps for EU4, Crusader Kings 2, India, and Imperator. And I'm now content design lead on CK3.
One of the things I wanted to talk about, and the reason we have Jakob here from Triumph, is the difference and the pros and cons between using a historical map that not everyone, but most people might have a reference to versus the unknown or randomly generated maps that might change from playthrough to playthrough. And I'd be interested to hear a bit about what do you consider to be the pros and the cons of the map types you guys have been working on. And I think we can start with the maps that have like a historical context. So this would be the PDS titles like Imperator, Crusader Kings, Hearts of Iron, and EU4. Gonna just push the question out there and see who picks it up.
I think that for historical maps, the advantage is definitely that the player sort of recognizes what they're working with, what they're playing on. It means a little bit more when you recognize, oh, this is that country, this is that country. Now I'm painting the map here, or that's an area that means something to me because of something that I've experienced in my past, and I want to conquer that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think just being familiar with what you're playing on plays a big part in how you perceive the map by itself. But it's also the player will have expectations it's a map that I know. It's something the player thinks you want the details for it, right? You have expectations for how accurate it should be and what things should be on the map, and it's something you'll have to work on when you make the map, I think, because it's trying to meet those expectations that the player will want to have on the map in relation to the time frame of the game and whatnot.
It's important to add perhaps that a special difficulty that exists when making maps like that is also for the areas where it's not very well known what was going on at the time, which can present some pretty unique difficulties in actually uncovering that.
Yeah, especially for certain the further back in history, right, our games go, the less we might know about a specific region, and because we're basing it on an actual physical map where at some point in time history has happened, there might be people that know a lot more about the area than we do, and the to move through that must be a bit of a challenge. Like you told me previously that, in air quotes, like the stuff you spend more time on designing is probably the places where you know the least, because the larger, like, for lack of a better term here, historical areas, there's a lot of context to draw from, whereas if we're going to other parts of the world, there might be a lot less.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true. A disproportionate amount of time is definitely spent on areas where there is a lot less documentation.
And this is not only with map work, this is also with all kinds of development. It's the stuff that you know the least of historically is usually the stuff that takes the most amount of time. Like minor nations in Hearts of Iron compared to major nations, you spend a lot more time doing research on the minor ones.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think like it's usually super straightforward and like, oh, we're just gonna like flesh out Europe on the map, or like in any context really, which is usually very well documented, so it's easy to know what to do and what to add. But the moment you actually move further away and go to a region that is well less documented, especially for our games that take place in way back in history, like CK or Imperator, where it's like trying to find what to put there can be a challenge at times.
Yeah, and it also means that sometimes we have to make compromises, I would say. Arriving at those is perhaps the most work.
No,
I agree. I think like finding the right compromise is like, okay, what do we put here? Like, what names do we use? It's like just trying to make something fit the game. And it's also like, take CK for example. It has a time span of almost 600 years. It's like, how do we reflect the entire time frame? Do we just go by the settlements that should exist on like the bookmark on game start? Do we want to include stuff that becomes important later on, for example? There's a lot of like considerations and compromises.
Yeah, and we'll get back to some of that in a bit. Jakob has sat here patiently listening to you guys ramble on about historical maps. Now, the maps that are used in Age of Wonders Planetfall are very different, and it takes a very different approach as well. Can you talk a bit about the same, like the pros and cons, but also the approach to map making for Planetfall, and what we consider or call in some cases like randomly generated maps?
Yeah, sure. So generally, good to know that Planetfall is a sci-fi game, so by default, the places that we reflect where are in the game world that is made up by ourselves, so it cannot be known to the player beforehand. And by randomly generated, we have two types of randomly generated maps, and there's the one where RMG basically takes over entirely according to design rules, which is not what my specialty is, but what mostly programmers have been working on with special RMG designers. But then there's the second type, which was our Planetfall campaigns, which is basically using that RMG and feeding extra information into it and shaping it into something that is still random, but less random than a full RMG experience. It's a little bit like if you imagine that there would be advanced options in an RMG map, just they're a lot more advanced than what the player gets, and we use it to create a experience with a story baked into it. So it's also a series of missions that are connected and that have stuff carrying over from one to the next. And there's definitely advantages and disadvantages to this approach. So the most obvious advantage is if it's random and has more variety, then it means that replayability for the player will be higher, because they also do not know what to expect, even if they played that map before. So there's something fresh to discover every time, even if the most important things maybe are designed in a way that it's still roughly the same. But also it means from a developer point of view that the maps are very flexible, because RMG is something that creates these maps every time they're generated. So if something crucial changes during development, like for example, say the movement speed of all units suddenly doubles, so your maps, the flow would completely be broken if they're handcrafted, and you would have to redo from scratch. But because it's RMG, you can just start adjust settings. You can say now the map size that we want is twice as big in both directions, and then there's some more things to adjust, of course, so it's not just one setting that you need to flip, but it's still something that you can adjust to. So in that sense, especially for a game that's changing a lot during development, it's a big advantage for the developer. Yeah, then maybe with regards to the cons, there's the con that I think players will call out first always, and that is that RMG maps can't fully emulate the charm and the atmosphere of handcrafted maps. So if you're designing RMG maps, you will hear sooner or later, oh, this is RMG map, just RMG map with some scripts. It's not really something special, because players, they, depending on what they go after, but some types of players really want that handcrafted, tailored experience that is especially more unique in a visual sense as well. So that's something that can't be reached, or you would have to limit the RMG in so many ways that all the disadvantages go away. There are some ways to counteract it a little bit, but I think we'll get to that later. Then another downside is that it's much harder to create a controlled environment when you make an RMG map, because also as a designer, you don't know how it's going to look exactly. So you can work towards making it controlled in ways that are important to the story or to the flow of a map. But reaching that control is a lot harder, because you can't, or it's much harder to create choke points or control how fast player explores. As an example, Age of Wonders 3 still had handcrafted maps, and there they often used impassable mountains to basically divide the entire map into pockets. So if you enter pocket 1, then there's gonna be story bit 1, and if you enter pocket 2, then there's gonna be the next bit of a story. But that kind of flow is just not possible with RMG maps.
So hopefully we have an idea of the different types and the different challenges. I want to go back to the maps based on on Earth essentially, and pick your brain a bit about the idea of, like, just because you have a map of Earth doesn't necessarily mean that it's fun to play straight away, right? Like, it's not, you can't just take, oh, here's a map of Europe, let's do game stuff to it, and then it works. So what do you do to make sure that your historical map follows your game flow and is, for lack of a better term, fun to play?
I think on Hearts of Iron that kind of goes automatically, just by reflecting. I mean, the nature of Second World War is that it's a war about resources. So just in paying attention to the actual existing world map of the time and reflecting all of the resources that are relevant to the gameplay experience, you already create an interesting map in itself. You get natural resources like steel and oil and all of these things, but you also get simple things like infrastructure and industry and even population. All of these things make various areas of the map more interesting in certain ways. For example, the Baku oil fields, Venezuela with their oil, or Central Europe with the industry, population of China and India, these kinds of things. They give a little bit of a personalized twist to all of the countries that you play in those areas, because each has a very different approach. And it also makes certain areas of the map actual strategic targets during the war, as they historically were, such as, historically the German push for the Baku oil fields. And if you're playing Soviet Union in the game, you're also going to want to defend those because it is important to your war effort.
Yeah, I think like in a similar vein, we don't have resources per se in Crusader Kings, but we definitely emphasize on having like variety play a big role. It's like certain places are gonna have less barony slots, for example, where you can build up your settlements, while other places, taking like Rome, for example, has like multiple baronies, and you are able to customize it to an extent, but really like emphasize like, yeah, this is a really good county. I can upgrade with a lot of buildings. I can emphasize and try to maximize the development to really have certain places stand out as, yeah, this is a worthwhile place to try to fight for. I want my capital to be here. We also like sprinkle the map with special buildings, for example, just trying to add another sense of variety and give the player like small occasions of just trying to spot and like, oh, I can build a cool special building here. I want that in my domain to get these cool bonuses.
Yeah, and I would say EU and Imperator, they deal with this kind of thing by having the things like the permanent province modifiers for things like the Silver Mountains in South America, and or even the fish market in Scania. And then we even try to place a few of these dynamically during a campaign with the spawn of institutions in EU. I would say that another thing to make things interesting is to make sure you find and identify all the interesting actors in each part of the map and make sure that they are there, because this kind of drives conflict and makes things interesting as well.
Terrain as well, right? Because all of our games have mountains, for example, and playing Switzerland in any of our games is a very different experience to, the Netherlands. Like as Switzerland, you might go, oh, well, France declared war on me, but, they're going to have to slog it out in the mountains where I have the advantage. And it's going to give you much more of a chance than if you're playing something that's just flat fields and you have no defensive bonuses whatsoever. On that note, one thing that I wanted to mention was the rivers and the river crossings on Imperator Rome, which are just such a amazing part of the map design there. Makes it very interesting and compartmentalizes the map a little bit more.
Yeah, I think Egypt in Imperator Rome kind of captures a number of these things actually, because it has the rivers and it has better agricultural output and lots of pops, which just makes the whole region very interesting and also important to capture.
And once again here to just get kind of like the other side of the coin here, when it came to Planetfall, what were like the important things there that you discovered that you had to think about when it came to like designing these randomly generated maps and making sure that, because it's no small task, right, to jump into a randomly generated map in a campaign or a story mission and make sure that like it's always interesting and always fun to play. Now, I'm sure some of them are going to be like there's always a degree of more or less interesting, but there's also like there needs to be a like minimum level of fun. Like how do you make sure that you get to medium level of fun at least? Preferably maximum fun levels achieved.
Well, yeah, I mean, the entire design process when doing RMG maps is of course very different, but one advantage that we actually have there is that the base RMG is also designed to be fun, right? So even before I start doing my job, there's already people in my team working hard to make the base game experience with RMG a lot of fun for the player. So basically, even if I don't add anything special, supposedly there should be already a decent level of fun for the player. But that said, of course, players expect something special when they play campaign. And I mentioned before that people, when they hear campaign in story mode, they have certain expectations. And it's important to, basically work on meeting those expectations where it's realistic. And to that end, what we do, or what we did in Planetfall, and what is the smart thing to do, is to try call out all the things that you make special already before to the player. So if you're going to visit a desert world, then there's going to be talk about it being a desert world with a lot of dry, arid areas and with little access to food sources. Or on the other hand, if there's like a planet that has a special gimmick, like one big advantage of RMG, you can do crazy things. Like we actually had a planet that shifted its climb every few turns, so it was going through terraforming cycles. And then we called out in advance, oh, this is a terraforming planet where which just goes through different phases and can turn into arid or volcanic or anything really. So that's one thing. Then the special concentration on the starting area of the player, because when they start the game, they expect to see something unique and cool, and you have to provide that. You basically have to make sure they immediately see this is different from normal RMG. So that's the second point. And then the third point is, for at least the approach that we took for making the map stand out, is that we had a tool in Planetfall, or maybe first going back a bit, but in Planetfall the map is divided into sectors, and the sectors have like special features. Like one sector is always complete Arctic, another one could be desert mountains, a third one could be a swamp, barren area, which also has a big galactic senate in it, just because there's like a structure in it that is really important. And for the campaigns, we could design custom sectors, which basically always were guaranteed to have certain features, and we could place them on the map, and they became the anchor points of our map design. So we pushed them to different locations, and the whole story was centered around these locations too. And then we made sure that the player would encounter them in the best possible order, at least. So, for example, that could be by just making sure that a very important player that they are gonna ask to be scouted anyway, that in the middle of scouting, they just find this location because we placed it in the middle between the player and that other player that he was supposed to meet. So in that sense, it's really concentrating on the things that are unique and calling those out. And then the other areas, they are still kind of fun to interact with, but more on the base level of fun. So that's really, you have to basically make sure that the efforts that you put in are seen and noticed.
Because and that kind of brings me to something you told me earlier that I hadn't really thought about, but the idea that because we kind of know where the player starts, and the further away from player start we put fun and interesting thing, kind of the less likely it is for the player to discover them, because you don't necessarily know how they're going to move around the map. And also there are probably other factions. Another faction might claim that sector before the player gets to it, which is why it's so important to make sure that, like you said, the interesting stuff is in the path of the player, because it's a lot harder to, I'm guessing, predict where a player goes in an RNG map compared to, oh, the player decided to play as the Netherlands. Let's see where they go. Probably next door to Belgium. Maybe. Who knows? We don't know. It actually brings me to another point that I find interesting, that we haven't necessarily had a discussion. We haven't had a chance to talk too much before we got into the panel, but I'd like to see what you guys generally think of like map visibility or fog of war. Like when you're walking around in Planetfall, right? You don't know what you're gonna discover. You don't know most of the map. Whereas while that might be true generally, like in CK3 or EU4, if you're a map noob like me that don't necessarily remember where things are outside of Northern Europe, there's still some expectation where things are supposed to be, right? So how does visibility of what's happening outside of the player area impact the gameplay experience? Sorry, very weirdly worded question.
Yeah, but it makes sense. I think it doesn't even relate too much, or like the problem isn't even that it's a historical map and so everything, you already know roughly where everything is. Like that doesn't mean that a fog of war isn't still useful. Like if you play something in Southeast Asia, for example, in Europa Universalis, and you progressively start exploring and discovering new areas of the world, and suddenly you notice that things have gone down in Europe, right? Like it's 200 years after the start of the game, and suddenly you notice that France is absolutely gigantic, and so are the Ottomans. Like you're still gonna get this sudden surprise, like, wow, what happened here, and how am I gonna deal with that, right? It's I think it can have an impact, even if it's historical.
I mean, I guess that's a fair point, because when general people talk about like fog of wars in a mode where like you discover things, what's kind of important there is you talked about it recently, like resources in the sense of just geographical space, whereas in a map that's kind of world map that's known, when you have a big blue blob of France and you don't expect it, there's still there's a discovery mechanic that's not necessarily geographically based in the same way, but of holy shit, France has a shit ton of resources all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Which
it's even something as it could even be something as simple as you haven't explored Europe yet, but you see England colonizing closer and closer, and you're like, okay, but is England actually doing really well on the continent? Am I in a lot of trouble here, or is this just like an England that has been half eaten by Scotland and it's trying to colonize its way out of trouble?
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I was just going to say that I think the same thing kind of exists even if you are playing in Europe and going elsewhere, and to see who actually dominates India or South America and so on,
exactly.
and also who got there first, perhaps. It's one of the great joys with exploration in EU, I think, that the map, even though it's the same, is still different when you get there.
Yeah, I mean, I think EU is a good case of it's a game that encourages exploring, but it also has like mechanics that ties into exploring. It's like not everyone can get to the new world, for example, and it's important to like, okay, I can start discovering it, and let's see who gets there first. And you might not even know exactly what it's going to look like, in the sense of where are all the native tags going to be, has someone else gotten there before me or not, and that's kind of like makes it interesting and adds a sense of unpredictability. And even if looking at Crusader Kings or Hoi, for example, it's like they don't have exploration in the same sense, but fog of war is still very important. Because we don't want the player to have full information on everything that's going on. Even if you can see like, oh yeah, I can zoom out and I can see that Germany has expanded, but I can't really see like where are their troops or what are they producing and those kind of things.
I mean, in Hearts of Iron, it's as simple as trying to see if you can navally invade in a certain area, but you don't see the troops there. You have to actually physically scout to see what troops are waiting for you there, and that adds another layer to that entire thing. There's also in EU, we have the Random New World, which ties in with the whole exploration thing, and this actually also ties into something that Jakob was saying earlier, that the downsides of a randomly generated map is that you can't craft it as well as a historical map, and it feels like EU try to do both, where it's a randomly generated map, but it's made up of handcrafted little bits that just get randomly put together. But Henrik can probably talk a lot more about that.
I'm going to say that the Random New World is an interesting experience because, as you say, it's we have hand-painted landmasses that are then combined and rotated and flipped to create an unknown new world. The thing is, it kind of runs the risk when you do something like this of having the drawbacks both of being predictable and essentially you have the risks of both the randomly generated and the hand-drawn maps, because while there are over 100 different landmasses that the Random New World is made of in EU, it's still not varied enough for some. And that's quite a common complaint about it. Still, I think it's an interesting approach to randomization, and probably the best one for our games. One thing I also wanted to mention in relation to what we just talked about with exploration, by the way, is one of the ways we actually test our maps is we run games with just the AI, and we kind of have the same experience as the player do when they're exploring by just looking at what happened during the night when the tests ran, to see who came to dominate each part of the
That's very true.
That's super interesting. We are running quickly towards the end of our time slot, but before we go, I have a question here that says, tell us about your favorite map hacks, which is also the question, pre-written question that has gotten the most comments, where the panelists are like, what the heck do you mean by that? So what I mean is not necessarily map hacks as in the cheat mode or something similar. I'm more talking about when you're map crafting and you're life hacking something, or you're adding a solution that you at first thought was like, this is not going to work, and then it's like, perfect, I've never created anything better than this. This is my Mappus Opus. I worked really hard on that pun, I'll have you know.
Yeah, my chuckle was indication of my appreciation.
So
yeah, it's
give me your map
question.
hacks.
I mean, I know of a couple in Hoy. So one of them is that, for example, the entire island of Britain is a little bit further away from the continent as it should be, purely to give a little bit more space there, and a space for a few more sea tiles, so that there's a little bit more strategic play going on there. And another thing that I did myself when I worked on the Dutch focus tree was that there's this causeway in the north of the Netherlands called the Afsluitdijk. It's about 30 kilometers long. It's just a causeway, very narrow, with a highway on top. There's literally no cover, no trees, very like maybe a building every couple of miles or something, but that's it. And in the Second World War, that was a very defensible position and a very hard one to attack. So to reflect that reality, I tinkered a little bit in the map files, and there's this one file that governs which provinces have access to other provinces, which ones are considered to be neighbors for movement and so on. And I just removed the neighborhood link between North Holland and Friesland, and then I pasted over the land bridge that was connecting them. I pasted what's called a strait, so that they would be forced to use a strait to cross that little area, to sort of try to indicate that it was a much more tricky prospect to cross that particular land bridge.
I mean, that sounds like a pretty good compromise and a nifty solution to do it, right?
I was very happy with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think we have like that many like actual map packs, if you want to call it that, in CK3. We did have some like fun stuff during development in general, though, in the sense like early on we didn't have like proper impassables, for example, and at one point we wanted to make them like colorable so that you could actually get to colors. You don't have like these tiny spots of uncolored areas on the map as you conquer and expand your realm. And the problem was that initially all of these provinces were using the same province ID, which meant that as soon as you conquered enough of impassable areas, you would color all of them. So it's like, okay, how do we solve this problem then? It's like, yeah, well, I guess we'll just have to go through the entire map and update them one by one and give them unique IDs, so that they actually are their own provinces, which kind of just like, it's a like a time sink to do it properly, but it's something that we had to do at one point.
And the CK3 team was like, let's bring in the map champion to do this tedious, busy work.
Exactly. So that was a lot of fun. But it also reminds me, like, back when they were all the same provinces, we used to have this hilarious bug because before they were properly impassable, you could actually move your armies into it. But since they were all the same ID, you could literally teleport your army from any impassable province to another. So we just ended up calling that the Mountain Express, and you could move your troops anywhere at any time.
So
it was a lot of fun.
So it had the same feature as the teleporters in Planetfall.
I mean, essentially, yeah.
EU4 also had this, right? I remember like certain
Kind of
provinces that were everywhere, and you could teleport between them.
I mean, it's a reoccurring bug actually in the random new world. Not one that's down to map design, but sometimes the thing that randomizes the land masses will use the same idea in more than one place, and then you can teleport between them. I think it might have been fixed, but I'm not sure.
Hopefully, right?
Yeah. It's pretty rare, at least.
Jakob, do you have anything for Planetfall?
Yeah, I mean, working with RMG feels a little hacky all the time, actually, because you never know exactly what's going to come out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's one kind of funny hack that I remember which one of our programmers did. So in the beginning of development, there were only Pangea and continent maps, so only maps with a lot of water in them. And at one point, I was working on the first campaign map, and I asked the programmer and said, well, I want to make this a land map. Can you give me something? So he said, yeah, I think I have an idea. So what he did was he just used the Pangea logic and replaced all water maps with mountains, and yeah, put that in. So basically land maps in Planetfall still to this point are water maps, just using mountains instead of water. And it works surprisingly well.
So like, it's perfect for those of us that rather go on a ski trip than go to the beach.
That's amazing.
We are quickly running out of time, but before we go, real quick, can you share some of your favorite feedback that you've gotten based on some of the maps you've worked on?
I think like just generally getting like a lot of appreciation for like the details and the tiny stuff you put into the game is pretty rewarding. It's like, oh, people actually notice, because you know our players tend to pay attention to the small things, and when they notice stuff like, oh, you did this really well, that's always kind of rewarding.
Oh yeah.
But I mean, on the flip side, it's also like you did something small. It's like I just made something to be done with it, right? And people like, aha, this holding over here could definitely use like this name instead, and then it provides you like with excellent examples or like good sources for like what it could be instead. That's also like really appreciative, because then we can always make the map better.
I would say that's actually the best kind of feedback to get, since we keep working on our maps. We've gotten some really good references over the years from players and from our beta testers.
Yeah, it really helps, because a lot of these people know a lot more about those specific regions than we do, and it's so useful to get those kinds of inputs.
So you heard it here. Well, you heard it here last. Send map references, everyone, to the PDS team.
Yes.
I definitely want to echo what Servant Core said. Like some of the best feedback has been like the really tiny things on Hoi, for example, just adding Sedan, for example, really insignificant village, but it was the place that the German army punched through, and just having people go like, oh yes, now I know, I read about this, and now I see it on the map, so I know where this happened. Or, you know, Operation Market Garden, having Arnhem added as a very small, insignificant victory point on the map, but just enough so that people see it and go like, oh yes, I know that name. I have some historical knowledge around that. It was really rewarding to hear that.
Yeah, especially when you spend a lot of time thinking about how to best represent something, it's nice to see when it's appreciated.
And now I'm unfortunately going to have to cut you off because we are out of time. Dricus, Jakob, Emil, and Henrik, thank you guys so much for talking about maps with me for 40 minutes. And hopefully you guys watching found it interesting. That's it for now. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
All right.